The article I chose to analyze was the education vaccine against HIV, which is a past issue. What does a researcher set out to do? The goal of this study is to identify if there is any connection between one's educational status and an increase or decrease in their risk of contracting HIV. The researcher hypothesizes that the higher the educational level, the lower the risk of HIV or AIDS. This is likely that the disease will be concentrated among illiterate or poor groups. Is it possible that education is the only possible vaccine against HIV? Why does the researcher feel it is relevant? As you may know, AIDS, HIV, is a pandemic in our world. In fact, little research conducted about HIV has been published. Initially, it was found that the higher the economic and educational status, the more vulnerable to HIV. However, because this pandemic is changing, researchers have sought to make connections between socioeconomic status and HIV and have identified that the higher the economic status, the reduced risks of contracting HIV. This is due to awareness, behavior, and more exposure to sexual health education. The study in this article seeks to identify if there are any connections between the level of education and the rate of HIV infection. What does previous research say? Since all countries around the world are at different stages regarding the exposure to AIDS, no clear connections have been made between HIV and education. However, research does indicate that countries that have higher levels of HIV infection would show a stronger and clearer correlation between HIV and education. The lower the infected population, the less likely there is a correlation. This is due to the fact that there is not a high enough number to obtain proper results, and it may be in fact more by chance. Additionally, the more exposure to sex education is effective in developing awareness and changing behavior that reduces the risk of poor sexual choices. The goal of the study is to identify how the educational vaccine works. Findings and conclusions. The study obtained 32 demographic and health surveys to analyze data. One survey per country was analyzed, 32 in all. The first category I will be covering is women's ignorance regarding HIV and AIDS based on education level. It was found that 1 in 2 illiterate women were uneducated about basic AIDS facts. This was 5 times higher than women who attained at least a full primary education. Furthermore, illiterate women were 3 times more likely to think an individual who looked healthy on the outside was in fact HIV negative. They were also 4 times more likely to believe that AIDS was unavoidable, and 3 times more likely to be unaware that the disease can be passed from mother to her unborn child. Findings and conclusions continued. It was found that in countries such as Uganda, where AIDS pandemic is much more populated, women were more educated on basic AIDS prevention education compared to countries with lower population of HIV-positive individuals. For example, in Peru, where the HIV population is lower, 8 out of 10 illiterate women lacked basic knowledge of AIDS, while only 1 in 10 did in Uganda. Indonesian surveys indicated that educated women showed improvement in their knowledge of AIDS over a 3-year period. Unfortunately, the population of illiterate women regarding AIDS education did not indicate any improvement. A higher mortality rate among children of illiterate mothers increased dramatically by 45% within 10 years in Kenya, while a decline in child mortality was seen in mothers with post-primary education who had AIDS. Interestingly, research found that in countries that are in the initial stage of the HIV pandemic, those that are well off tend to be more at risk in contracting the AIDS virus. However, the opposite is the case in more infected populations, showing that higher education and socioeconomic statuses decrease risk. This is due to the higher opportunity and exposure of sex and AIDS education, as well as better choices made regarding prevention. How findings compare to this course. This study shows that the educational access and opportunity are a major problem that must be solved. Too many women around the world are illiterate. Quality education should be made available to all, despite geographic locations, economic status, race, or gender. Unfortunately, lack of education is affecting their quality of life. Their ability to survive is of higher importance than their desire to be educated. However, their lack of education is causing poor life choices. Education is our best tool in battling pandemic issues such as HIV and AIDS. My opinion. It was interesting to identify a connection between one's education levels and their risk of contracting HIV. More information regarding pandemic issues need to be available to all through whatever means necessary. This study gives a different outlook on the importance of education regarding survival and life choices that are important to consider in regards to educational access and opportunity. The poor and illiterate population should not be excluded from education. Education should in fact be a right, not a privilege.